started because we got a lot of information to share, and we've been trying to shorten these webinars down to about 45 minutes, trying to be respectful of your time, but knowing that certainly this topic of stay interviews is something that is top of mind for many organizations. And so we've got a lot of information we want to share with you today, and we won't get through it all. I do want to encourage everyone to feel free to ask questions. So there should be a question box in your webinar page. Feel free to submit your questions as we move along. I will try and pause a couple of times to make sure and remind you to ask questions, but we welcome you asking those, and I will try and pause and answer just as many of those as I possibly can. Again, my name is Danny Nelms. I'm the CEO at Work Institute, and a lot of the information that we're going to be sharing today is out of our annual retention report. So it is one of our key publications that we have been doing every year since 2017. We take a lot of data that we collect primarily from our exit interviews, but also from stay interviews that we do, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. And present that information in our annual retention report. It's a free publication. You can go to our website, www.workinstitute.com, go to the resources tab, and you can download any of the retention reports that you'd like there. So anytime I start to talk about employee retention and things like stay interviews, the first thing I always like to do is just kind of review the climate that we're in. And it has certainly been an interesting climate. Over the last 2.5 or so years. I've made an interesting point. I managed to avoid COVID for about 2 years, but then got it about a month ago. And I actually know more people personally that have gotten COVID over the past sort of 4 to 6 weeks than I did previously. So unfortunately, we can't quite eradicate ourselves of COVID, but I think we've all kind of learned to deal with it and live with it. But hopefully all of you out there are staying healthy and are avoiding it the best you can. So for us, it all starts with looking at the number of voluntary terminations. And obviously we all have begun to refer to it as the Great Resignation. And I think when the Great Resignation began in 2021, and we felt like that it was really maybe a product of rethinking people's lives as a part of the pandemic, and so many things had changed in our workplace that it was going to be one of those things that would sort of jump up from a trend perspective and then start to get back to some more quote normal level, but that has not happened. It just continues. We are going to probably exceed 50 million people leaving their jobs voluntarily in 2022. So the trend has just stayed high. Historically, we've seen, kind of 3 to 3.5 million people leaving their jobs voluntarily. During the really height of the pandemic, that number was close to 4.5 million, reaching 5 a couple of times. It is still staying above 4 million. So really about 500,000 more people a month leaving their jobs voluntarily than what we've seen kind of historically. It is a real challenge for organizations right now. One of the things that we're seeing is that we just don't believe that companies are doing enough. And I go back to the pandemic and maybe just thinking that the Great Resignation was really a product of the pandemic and kind of coming out of that time period. But I think it's much deeper than that. And, we've talked a lot about it, and we've got some numbers we'll show you a little bit later. But I think that organizations are going to have to step up. They're going to have to start to do more. And I think that's where stay interviews really come into play. The supply demand issues that we've been seeing haven't changed. The number of open jobs is still sitting right around 10 million or so. And the number of unemployed people that we've got is resting right around 5 million. So it's basically 2 open jobs to every 1 employed person. And that creates significant supply and demand issues. And what I really like to point out in this graph is that if we go back to sort of pre-pandemic times in 2019, and by the way, it wasn't until 2018 that these lines actually crossed, where we had more job openings than we had the number of unemployed people. We know what happened during the pandemic and then how quickly unemployment really began to decline, and those number of job openings just continue to rise. So it's the space between these two lines that we see now, and it's really staying at about the same level. Even though the job openings have come down slightly, unemployment's still resting at about 3.5, 3.6%. So we've just got a greater level of supply and demand right now in our workforce than we've ever had historically. So it is really creating some challenges. The one thing this is not a really important graphic. I just think it's interesting in some ways, but I also think it's explanatory in some ways, is that when we look at unemployment from sort of a historical perspective, going back to even 2002, and, we had a little small recession in the early 2000s, and it took us really until around 2007 for unemployment to get down to close to that 4% range. Then we had the major recession in 2008, 2009. Look how long it took for unemployment to get down to that, under 4%. I mean, it literally took, almost 8 years for that unemployment to go down. We have this big spike during the pandemic, and then look how quickly it came back down. And I think it really is almost like whiplash for employers, because historically, when we've had these recessionary periods, we've had long tails in terms of how long it would take unemployment to get down to what we would consider full employment. Now, we all know that the recession that was created by the pandemic, excuse me, was certainly different. And so, we really didn't know what to expect in terms of longer term unemployment, but we've seen that it's returned. And then even with talk of, recession now, we're not seeing the unemployment numbers move at all. Again, the unemployment's still staying at around 3.5%. So, we just have not seen the rise in unemployment like we would expect. And I think that goes back to the supply demand issues. Even with some recessionary triggers that are out there and some trends, a lot of good things outside of the stock market that are still really strong, and that includes the open jobs. The thing I bring up around labor force participation is just the idea that I think I was still hearing it as soon as last week with a group of CEOs I was meeting with, that there's still this idea that there's a lot of people that just don't want to work and they're sitting on the sidelines. And the labor force participation numbers just don't point to that. And the reason is because we actually reduced the size of our labor force. 5 million people retired during the pandemic time period. Another million people, unfortunately, have passed away due to complications of COVID. And our birth rates are down. So we simply have a smaller labor force in general. And so there's not this huge portion of people that are sitting out on the sidelines. The last thing I want to mention is just how much this is costing us. I literally just got a email just a few minutes ago from a colleague who there's some documents that came out from Amazon, and that showed that their turnover costs were in excess of $8 billion. And that's billion. So, the overall cost of turnover in the US in 2021 was somewhere in the 700 trillion range. And it certainly continues to increase as this voluntary turnover rate increases. And what we're starting to see is that the cost of turnover is actually going up. We've been using $15,000, but what we've seen is that wages have gone up and the replacement cost have gone up slightly. So we think that number is starting to get closer to probably 18,000 or so, maybe even close to 19, where we used to use 33%. I've seen some numbers recently looking at around 39% as the cost of turnover. And this is going to be important because I think whenever we're talking about employee retention, when we're talking about employee turnover, we have to be looking at the cost. We have to understand what it's costing the organization, because whether it's stay interviews, whether it's doing additional training, leadership development, whatever it is that we as leaders believe we need to do in order to impact or reduce turnover, usually there's some cost to it. Well, we can show the ROI if we're looking at how much that turnover is costing us. And still, I do, probably a dozen or more speaking engagements a year. And when I'm talking to organizational leaders and ask them if they're tracking the cost of turnover, typically it's no more than 10% of the people in the room. So I think this is something that I will continue for a long time to encourage leaders, that you have to be looking at what is it costing your organization. That's what's going to spur action. So I want to talk about the reasons people leave. And again, I want to mention right here that I know you joined this webinar because you wanted to hear about stay interviews, and we're going to get there, and we're going to have to get there pretty quick. But I think one of the things about stay interviews is that they are meant to be current. They are meant to be practical, and they're meant to address the things that are going on right now. And so I think that in order to make sure that your stay interviews are being effective, I think we need to look at some of the things that are actually causing people to leave. What are those biggest turnover risk factors, if you will? So again, we've been conducting exit interviews for hundreds of organizations for, over 20 years now. And we conduct about 30,000 exit interviews on an annual basis. And we take all that data, we put it all together, and that's what creates our retention report. So we believe we have one of the most robust normative databases around reasons for leaving in the US. Certainly the number of exit interviews that we do is large, but we also think it's very accurate in that we are using what we think is the most accurate methodology. So 90% of these exit interviews are done obviously with an outside party, and they are done at least a couple of weeks after the employees leave. And that has been shown to be one of the major factors in whether you're getting the real reason for leaving is, do you do the exit interview after the employee leaves? So I think the reason why our data looks different from others sometimes is because some 75 to 80% of all exit interviews are done on or before the last day of employment. And the research is very clear that the best time to do it is after the employee leaves. So what we see is that for, I guess it's the 12th consecutive years, that career reasons continue to be the biggest factor that is causing employees to leave. Now, I will say that the pandemic did affect career reasons in a unique way. Historically, we've always seen employee development as the number one sort of sub-theme, if you will, amongst the career reasons. And what we saw in 2021 is that the different career actually eclipsed development. So, in this way, kind of the media got it right, because there was a lot of talk of people reconsidering their career, thinking about doing some things differently, getting out of accounting and getting into healthcare, or getting out of healthcare and getting into hospitality, or whatever it was. There certainly was a fair amount of that. What I always find interesting, though, is how many times these different career paths exist in the same company. And yet those people chose to leave that company to go pursue that, as opposed to staying with the company they were with. So that's something really important. From there, we get into particular job reasons. We get into health and family reasons, certainly work-life balance. And notice that here we have total rewards. I just can't emphasize enough that, again, 1 in 10 people actually cite total rewards or pay as the reason they left. And it is the most common misconception that we have in employee retention, is that people are always leaving for pay. I've said many times, I think managers always think that people are leaving for pay. I think human resources thinks they're leaving because of the managers. And neither of them is completely true. And that's why I think a robust exit interview process is so important, because we really need to understand the truth. Data will lead you down the path that you need to go if you're paying attention. So the data, I think, is pretty clear in terms of why people are leaving their jobs, and career being the number one thing. And we're going to get to that more when we talk about the stay interviews and kind of the content of a stay interview. One of the things that we do here is just we actually ask people to tell us all the reasons they left, and then we ask them to tell us the most important. And the one thing I always point out here is around total rewards. So it's still not a big number, but notice that when we look at all reasons, that total reward number goes up a little bit. But then when we ask what was most important, it actually goes down. So sometimes it is a factor, but again, it's not the most important, or what we would consider the root cause. The same thing is true of their manager. But then when we look at things like career reasons, we see that the most important reason is much higher than all the reasons. And so again, when it comes down to what that root cause is, then it's more often things like career, it's things like health and family, certainly some work-life balance issues. So I think this is just really an interesting way to look at it. In terms of kind of trends, once again, we see career reasons have really trended up. Not surprising in 2020 during the peak of the pandemic. People were really buckling down. They were in their job. We had high unemployment, so they were staying in place. And so even turnover had gone down, obviously. But as soon as that turnover started to come back up and we were experiencing the Great Resignation, then that's when we see these career numbers really just skyrocket. So, what we're seeing is, 2 out of every 5, a little more than 2 out of every 5 employees that's leaving is leaving for some type of career reason. A couple of other things that I find interesting here, obviously health and family reasons rose during the pandemic, and they have started to trend back down. So that's a good sign. We still haven't gotten to the pre-pandemic levels, but they are starting to trend down. The other thing is the work-life balance issues. So work-life balance was really up there as number 2 reason after career reasons when we look back to 2019. And look how far that number has now gone down. Now, a couple of things are really driving this, but I think the number one thing that's driving it is the ability to have an alternate work arrangement. I think workers have been asking for this for a long time. I think employers have been resisting it for a long time. The pandemic really, required that we work remotely in so many instances. And now what we're seeing is that it's being more readily adopted. I found out an interesting statistic a few weeks ago, and that is just anecdotally, I figured that somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 35% of the U.S. workforce was probably able to work some sort of an alternate work arrangement. McKinsey actually put out a study a few weeks ago that found that right at 53%, basically half the workforce had the ability to have some sort of an alternate work arrangement. So that is a huge number, much, much larger than I anticipated. So we do have to be paying attention to how we're dealing with these alternate work arrangements. We've got to be flexible. We've got to make sure that we're listening to our employees and what they want. I know that we're all concerned about productivity. We're concerned about culture. We're concerned about engagement. We're certainly concerned about retention. But we're going to have to figure this out. We're going to have to look at what those factors are. And I think, again, stay interviews are one of the things that we're going to have to be utilizing to better understand how employees are adapting to these alternate work arrangements and how we're going to work through those issues. The last thing in terms of a trend is, again, we have seen total rewards trend up even since 2019. But I, again, go back to less than 1 in 10 employees will actually cite pay as the number one reason or the root cause why they left their organization. I think this is always interesting to look at, is the difference in terms of male versus female in terms of their reasons for leaving. I think from a normative database perspective, I don't know that this is critical to pay attention to. What I think is critical is that you're paying attention to it within your organization. The question is there, and this was really something that I've picked up recently from a client, but are males and females experiencing your organization differently? You know, are they experiencing career opportunities? Are they experiencing career advocacy? Are they experiencing career navigations the same? The same is true with health and family, or the job itself, or work-life balance. All of those things. The question is, are both males and females experiencing your organization in the same way? And therefore, is it different reasons for leaving for the different sexes based on what is their overall experience? So I think this is something you've got to be looking at in your internal data and understanding, are those reasons different? The other thing I always like to point out, and I know a lot of you probably on this webinar have been on webinars before, so I'm sorry if I continue to beat this drum. When we look at things like the generations, right? So we always think about, what are these generational differences? And certainly there are some, and this is not meant to be getting into all of those things, but we rely on data, and we look at the data as it relates to why people are leaving. And we look at it not so much from the standpoint of the generations, but look at it really from 20 to 29 as being more early career, 30 to 49 being mid-career, 50 to 60 and older being, later in your career. And what we find is that early in your career, people are leaving for career reasons more. And then that starts to decline over time. Is that surprising? No, not really. I think people that are earlier in their career are looking for upward mobility. And let's all face it, if any of you are like me and I'm in my 50s, my career progressed much more rapidly in the first 10 or 15 years. And then you spent more time in a particular job as you moved up in your career ladder. But things like health and family are fairly consistent across that. The job itself gets more important as you get later in your career. Who you're working for gets more important. We relocate fewer times when we get older and later in our career. Things like pay are really not different across any of the career cycles. And the same is true of work-life balance. So again, we talk about millennials or Gen Z or all these things, and we say they're all about work-life balance, but that's not what's causing them to leave. They're no different than any of the other categories. So I think, again, too many times we assume things or we stereotype people, and we need to really get away from that. A couple of other just quick notes, and then we're going to jump into the stay interview, is looking at things that attract employees to new employers. So again, career reasons by far are the biggest issue, but we do notice that pay is an attractor. So, 2 out of every 5 employees will note that pay was an attractor. And this is what I say about that. You don't pay me enough to put up with X. So the reason you left is not for pay, it's because of not the right career development, or not having promotion opportunities, or not having the right work-life balance, or not liking the job you're doing. Pay is a proxy for that. You don't pay me enough to put up with this job. You don't pay me enough to do 2 jobs. You don't pay me enough to not develop me and where I want to go in my career. So it is an attractor to a new employer that they might be paying more. But again, it's not the root cause as to why they left. So one of the things that I think about when I think about stay interviews is looking at what happened in the wake of the pandemic, okay? When we look at Q2 of 2020, we see all of our core driver scores, and Work Institute spent a lot of time looking at what are the core drivers of retention and engagement, and we've really tried to keep it simple. It's about the company as an employer, the person I work for, the team or the people I work with, and the job itself. It's really no more complicated than that. What we saw in the wake of the pandemic is that these ratings all went up, and they went up pretty substantially. Company scores went up by 50%. Manager scores went up by 34%. The job scores went up by 42%. certainly we would have expected a little bit of that to come back down, and they did slowly decline. But then we see this big drop between Q1 of 2021 and Q2 of 2021. And this is really when the Great Resignation began. And our premise, and what we have talked about a lot, is really that we think employers caused the Great Resignation. And that's because they found that they had a level of care and concern, level of communication, managers were available, there was a clarity of expectations in the wake of the pandemic that we've gotten away from. And so I think when we think about stay interviews, one of the things that I want to encourage you to do is to ask about, what did you like about how we were doing things back just after the pandemic set in? What were the good things that the company was doing? Because apparently we've gotten away from many of those good things, and we may need to go back to some of them. And so I think a stay interview is a great way to find that out. I think, again, this to me is setting the stage for the stay interview. Because again, I think so many times we think about pay as being the most important. I don't want to say that it's unimportant, but what our data tells us is that, yes, pay is important, but employees expect to be developed. They want to grow and learn. In many cases, employees want to see how their career can progress. Many employees want to be able to explore different career paths. Employees want a certain work-life integration or work-life balance. They want a supportive organizational culture with transparent communications. They expect managers to understand them as a person, to provide support and treated professionally. Employees want well-being emphasized and an understanding of caring for family members. And yes, employees want to be paid competitively. But when we think about the stay interview, it's really all of these things that we have to be able to tease out related to the relationship that we have with our employees. So let's jump into the stay interview conversation, right? So a stay interview is really part of what we would say is a broader voice of the employee model, right? So oftentimes we're doing recruitment studies or candidate experience studies. A lot of us are actually getting early feedback as employees are onboarding to find out more about their early experience. Pulse surveys have become very common. Most companies are still doing some sort of an annual engagement survey, satisfaction survey, climate assessment, whatever you want to call it. And a lot of companies are still doing exit interviews. Stay interviews are fairly new. And I think that we're still trying to sort out exactly how they fit into our overall voice of the employee model. I think about them as being a little more situational, but also something that we probably need to look at as being periodic, meaning probably at least a couple of times a year, maybe more often. There needs to be a very specific conversation about retention and why an employee is staying and what might be causing them to consider leaving. And that's really all about what a stay interview is. It's a very structured discussion that's conducted with each individual employee to learn the specific actions the manager needs to take to strengthen that employee's engagement and retention with the organization. Now, that's the textbook definition, if you will. We're going to talk a little bit about whether HR should be conducting them or whether maybe an outside third party should be conducting them. But this is really where it started. And it really started so that we could identify at-risk employee segments, so we can know what intent to stay was. In other words, we know those people that were at risk. We could, intervene in very specific ways to prevent turnover, and also that we could plan our overall retention strategies based on what we're learning from our stay interviews. And stay interviews really became popular back in 2010. There's a gentleman by the name of Dick Finnegan. He wrote the book called The Power of Stay Interviews. It was on the Society for HR Management library for, I assume it's still there, but it was the top seller for, I think, 3 years. He's since updated the book and also created this guide for managers. And so this is really where the beginnings of the stay interview started. Now, one of the things that Dick and I have talked about is that Dick always felt like the stay interview replaced the exit interview. And I really feel like those two things are complementary. We definitely want to be conducting stay interviews, but at the same time, we still need to know why employees leave when they leave. Because think of the time between when a stay interview might occur and when they might decide to leave. So we still need to be looking at the real reasons why employees leave. But this book is a great resource. Again, you can still get it on wherever you buy books. I've bought recently on Amazon. You can also buy it in a digital version. So this is really where stay interviews got started. What are their strengths? Well, to me, the number one strength is that the supervisor or manager hears why the employee stays or why they're considering leaving. I think one of the things that is a challenge in when we look at exit data, when we look at employee engagement data, is that we're really looking at that more often than not on a broader basis. We're trying to protect the anonymity of the respondent. So it's really not about the person, it's about the data. And I think when a manager is conducting an exit interview, they're hearing it directly from the employee, why they're staying with the company, why they would consider leaving. So it creates authenticity to that conversation, and I think it creates reality for the manager. It's very clear what the employee's priorities and expectations are, and they can be clearly understood by leadership and by the managers. We can do things quickly. Sometimes what we find is that manager is going to hear in their stay interview something that they can take immediate action on to fix, whether that's a slight adjustment in their schedule, whether that's an adjustment to the work arrangement, whether it's an alteration that they can make to the job itself. All of those things can potentially be done quickly. The next steps are clearly in control of the supervisor or manager. So even if they don't do something immediately, they know what needs to be done, and they can plan to do that, and hopefully will do that in the very near future. And again, we just make sure that the individual leader understands that their employees' engagement or retention is what matters most, and that it's really about the individual. For us, there's really 4 key elements of the stay interview. First and foremost, we talk about conducted by the manager or supervisor. I do get asked a lot whether it's appropriate for HR to conduct a stay interview. I have mixed feelings about it. Number one, I'm never going to discourage a really good conversation between a manager and employee. I think that relationship is key to everything, and I want us to encourage having good conversations between the manager and the manager or supervisor and their employee. However, we do know that there are managers that aren't effective. As much as we'd like to think they are all effective, there are some that aren't. There are cultures where we just feel that employees are not going to be truthful with their managers. And sometimes the manager themselves is just the problem. So there are circumstances where I think either the HR could be a factor in this, or it may need to be outsourced altogether. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Preparation is key. One of the things that I think is happening is that for a long time, I think for a while, I don't know really how far it dates back, but we've been talking about one-on-ones. We have a one-on-one with our employees. A lot of times those are weekly, maybe bi-weekly, they might even be monthly. I think one-on-ones are still really good, but my impression is that a one-on-one is really focused around the work that needs to be done. We tend to be talking about what are the current projects, what are the current requirements, what are the current trends, those type of things. I think it tends to center around the work that needs to be done. In a stay interview, we're trying to get away from the day-to-day and get to a broader conversation around how the employee feels about working for the company. And are they thinking of staying a long time, or are they at risk? And if they're at risk, what are the reasons why they're at risk? So I think the preparation is key. We need to go into this with a really strong idea as to what we're trying to find out, what we want to learn from employees, and then how we're going to act on that information. It needs to be structured. I think, you know, unfortunately, and for those of us that have been in HR for years, I think about it the same thing I do a job interview, right? So how many times have we seen managers go into a job interview and all of a sudden they have, you know, a couple 5 or 10 minutes of a great conversation, and then it just goes off the rails? Not in a bad way per se, but we end up talking about the things that are easy to talk about as opposed to asking the difficult questions. And so I think the interview itself needs to be structured so that we make sure that we get to the difficult questions. And that's why the managers must be trained. I think that we still have a tendency to say, hey, we're going to introduce this idea of a stay interview. We give them a couple of sheets of paper, maybe a form that needs to be filled out, and we really don't train them on how to conduct it. What is the purpose behind it? How are they going to overcome objections? How do they build rapport? All of the things that I think are really important in a stay interview. By the way, I have not seen any questions, unless I've just missed them. I'm trying to keep an eye out. So don't forget, if you've got questions, feel free to ask them, and I will try and get to them as we continue to move along. Some common stay interview questions, and I definitely like these questions. I think they're really good. But these are really the questions that Dick talks about, and certainly most experts talk about is, you know, what do you look forward to every day on your way to work? You know, what are you learning and what do you want to learn? Why do you stay employed here? When is the last time you thought about quitting? What can I do to make your job better for you? I think that's I think those are all really good questions, but I also want to go back to, are we being specific enough based on the fact that we know why people are leaving? There's nothing here necessarily specific about your work arrangement or work-life balance. Are we asking where do you want your career to go, right? Here we say, what are you learning? But where do you want your career to go? What are you interested in? So we've got to make sure that we're addressing all of those things in our exit interview. And that's why I wanted to go through what are the things that people are why they're leaving. So apparently there is questions in the chat box and I've got to find it. So hang with me for just a second.
William's answering the chat.
Okay. Yeah, apparently as the host, I don't think that I have access. So I think William is from our marketing team is answering most of your questions, and certainly I'll talk about at the end if you got questions how to contact me. One of the things that Work Institute again is worked a lot on is the core drivers of retention engagement. So it's about the organization, the manager, the team, and the job. And so we've looked at how these core drivers predict turnover reasons. And so we've looked at them and said the manager actually, the manager ratings predict 6 categories for leaving. And these are career issues, environment or culture issues, involuntary reasons, job, manager, and work-life balance. So again, I want us to make sure that when we're building our stay interview, that we're building those questions and building that structure around the things that are causing people to leave. And we know that the relationship between the manager and the reasons for leaving is critical. So are we touching on these issues related to work-life balance? Are we focusing on these issues related to our culture? Are we focusing on the job itself? Are we asking, as me as a manager, what can I do better or what can I do differently? And are we doing a good enough job in terms of your work-life integration? So those are all critical things that I think we need to make sure that we're including in our stay interview. And maybe our stay interview questions need to rotate a little bit. You know, we don't want this to turn into a 2-hour conversations, but it does need to be centered around the things that are putting employees at risk. The company as an employer certainly predicts 5 of the categories for leaving, but it's really, to me, all about the manager themselves. And I really think that role, and I've really addressed this, is, how well are we developing our managers to be career coaches? And that gets back into, if we're developing our managers to be career coaches, I think they're going to do a better job when it comes to the stay interview. Because again, so much of this stay interview is it's going to revolve around the career. It's going to revolve around learning. It's going to revolve around development. There's certainly going to be some job issues. There's going to be some work-life balance issues, but I think it's going to start at that place. We're also going to have to make sure that we're pulling in some of those cultural issues. So the manager and the supervisor, I can't tell you how much I think we need to be doing a better job of developing them. Because I think this is going to help them to be better when it comes to the stay interview itself. We're about to run up on time here. So I wanted to just point out a couple of things related to maybe outsourcing your stay interviews. So all indications are that Work Institute may have been the very first company that actually was doing an outsourced stay interview. One of our Fortune, 500 clients, maybe even Fortune 100 clients, back right after Dick's book came out, said they really liked the idea, but they wanted someone else to do them that was outside. So we started to conduct stay interviews. So we probably do 5,000 to 10,000 stay interviews a year for our clients. But why is that? Well, number one is concerns that the managers are unable to determine the real issues that are facing the employees. In other words, they're not trained. They're not willing to ask the difficult question. They're just not an effective manager. So those are some big reasons why either HR or an outside third party might be able to do it better. One of the big ones I find is that when we are doing internal stay interviews, we don't tend to roll up that data in very meaningful ways. In other words, we don't really see trends across the organization. We don't really see significant issues. And so we've got to make sure that we are somehow being able to see if there are broader trends at play. And that's when outsourcing them to a company like Work Institute can come into play, because we have all of those capabilities. And that helps us to actually identify some of the broader organizational issues. Let's face it, managers are the problem sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes. And is an employee really going to tell the manager that you're why I'm considered leaving? I don't think so, not very often. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we want to consider outsourcing it. And lastly, we find that the questions are much more structured. They include rating items so that, again, we can get some of those broader trends that are going. So I want to kind of summarize by thinking about the outputs of what you want from your stay interview. So the first thing we want to do is we wanted to identify at-risk employee segments, or at least identify the at-risk factors. So a stay interview is absolutely going to help us do that. It's more proactive than an exit interview because we're identifying the at-risk factors. So we really are doing something much more proactive. So finding those at-risk employees and those at-risk issues are going to be helpful for the organization and can try and reduce turnover. We know the intent to stay population. So we start to learn who are those employees that are going to stay for a long time, but more importantly, why are they staying for a long time? Because we can start to say, well, are different reasons putting people at risk versus why they're staying for a long time? Or are we simply missing it somewhere along the way in terms of how we're addressing different groups? So we may have a strength in IT, but we've got a weakness in accounting. So we've got to be able to look at those things in those different groups. And so we can learn very specific ways to prevent turnover, maybe not overall, but certainly within those groupings. And we can certainly plan our retention strategies much more effectively. So to me, there's really three things that I think organizations and companies can do right now. So number one, I think you have to know why employees leave and what risk factors cause employees to consider leaving. So High quality stay interviews, I'll insert here also high quality exit interviews, I think are necessary to understand the why and the risk factors related to retaining employees. Number two, I'm going to go back to it. We've got to be putting dollars to the problem. So you've got to assign costs to both the actual turnover and the turnover risk. And again, this is a tough one. It's a little easier when you're outsourcing them, but we can certainly talk about that if you'd like. And then number three, again, I don't want to, kind of dwell on this, but managers tend to step up in the wake of difficult circumstances of the pandemic. All of our data pointed to the fact that it seemed as though the managers really stepped up. And so I think we need to be supporting our managers. I think we need to be evaluating their leadership development models. Are we helping them tackle the real issues of today? And I think helping them to learn about stay interviews and how to conduct them is really, really important in that process. It does look like I finally got access to the chat box. There's a couple of questions here. Any thoughts on the challenge of stay interviews being conducted by the manager when a significant percentage of employees resign because of their relationship with their direct manager? Again, I think I've addressed that in that I think this is a time when maybe HR is an appropriate function to conduct the stay interviews. I still worry, are employees going to be willing to open up to HR? I mean, in some cases, I think they will, but other cases they will not. And I think that's where you might want to consider, do you outsource it to a third party like Work Institute? One other question, I'd be curious to hear any mention of long COVID as it relates to the state of the workforce, employee satisfaction, et cetera. I mean, I think this is one of the things we just don't have any data on right now. And long COVID is we just don't know really what it is. We don't really know the effects. And then we also get into how are we looking at a person's wellness versus their engagement scores or their retention. And so, the question is, how are we going to identify long COVID as a wellness issue? So, and then you've got HIPAA and all those things that come into play. So I think this is going to be a tough one to answer, but it'll be interesting to see how the data plays out over the next few years. One other question, maybe if managers are having stay interviews one-on-one with their employees, what recommendations do you have to consolidate and aggregate results to make meaningful use of the data collected? So there's a couple of different ways. One is the old-fashioned, we got to write it down on paper. So I've seen organizations that had specific forms that were meant to be filled out by the manager when they're conducting a stay interview. And then that gets turned back into HR so that they can pull all that data together. There are some online tools out there, kind of basically similar to a survey, but they're being used by the manager to input data. We've done this with a few clients over the years where they're actually inputting data as they're going through the exit interview themselves. I think the challenge there is that, again, does it make for a comfortable conversation between the manager and the employee if they're constantly kind of inputting the data? I don't know. They're probably more comfortable with them taking notes, but that is certainly the most effective way to try and aggregate this data up to more of an organizational level. One additional question, did you recommend stay interviews be conducted a few times a year? Yeah, I'm sort of at that place where I say, either twice a year or quarterly. I think more often than not, where it becomes overkill and we're just not having meaningful conversations. I think sometimes when we have a stay interview, we need to make sure that we've got a specific follow-up conversation that we're having. So that could be important. But I think somewhere between 2 and 4 times a year is kind of where I'm at in terms of where I'm thinking that it makes sense, especially if it's that manager and employee. If we're going to use HR, we're going to get to a third party, then, I think we've got to look at that in sort of the overall broad strategy. It relates to your overall voice of the employee model. So I apologize. I ran over about 5 minutes. There was just so much information here. I want everyone to know my contact information. I love talking about this stuff, if you couldn't tell. So you are more than welcome to reach out to me. Phone number here at the office, 777-6400. My email, DannyNelms@workinstitute.com. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Send me a direct email. If it's just a conversation that you want, to ask some advice and counsel around how you think you should conduct them, happy to have those conversations. So reach out to us and I'd be more than happy to have that conversation. Hope everyone has a great rest of the week. Continue to stay safe out there. And I'll talk to you soon. Thanks so much.